Yeah, it's cold out here. Snowstorm up to your knees with no sign of it melting anytime soon. It's been a week since Allerikstadr and it hasn't stopped. Let me just get inside here out of the snow. What's that? Wait, fresh vegetables? They look like they were picked this morning. How? It seems like every new piece of media about the Vikings is obsessed with snow. If there isn't a frozen crag and snowy forest, it just isn't the same. The Vikings eke by on the edge of existence, focused on hunting and trapping as their main food source, supplemented by meager harvests on barren soil. Oh, and there's always a risk of getting mauled by a polar bear. This doesn't feel weird though, like at all. After all, Scandinavia is way up by the Arctic Circle, and we've all seen the images of snow piled up higher than houses. So, this is just how Scandinavia is, right? I mean, look at Uppsala. That's the most Viking image the History Channel could have possibly had. Let me just see if it matches the actual Gamla Uppsala. Oh. Well, maybe that's just a fluke? I mean, Denmark is a great Viking stronghold. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok were supposedly from there. It must be spectacular. Ow. Huh. Well, maybe that's just a low point? No. Dang. It is clear that the association of the Vikings with harsh weather and jagged peaks is to some extent artificial. While Norway and Iceland are genuinely mountainous, Denmark and eastern Sweden just aren't. And remember, the most common name for the Vikings in Old English is Danes. It's also kind of an incoherent aesthetic. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the constant snowdrifts somehow don't stop fresh vegetables from growing or the oak trees from having green leaves. Even more egregiously though, there are polar bears wandering around. The part of Norway that exists in the game is south of Bergen. We're literally 1,000 miles away from where polar bears live. The upcoming game Crimson Desert has the same problem. Their fantasy Vikings also have green vegetation underneath the snowdrifts. And I get it. Dead trees aren't exactly pretty to look at, but come on. Nevertheless, this association of Vikings with winter, snow Vikings if you will, is everywhere. Crusader Kings 3 described their northern lords as coming from a land of snow and legend. In the Banner Saga, the Varl live in icy tundra. In Warhammer, the Norska live in the ice. Even cartoon games like Skylanders have this association. Given that, it's worth taking a look at where this trope came from and what it actually means. Since we're talking about the Vikings here, in some way or another, it makes sense to start looking for an association of the Norse with frost in the Viking Age itself. It isn't there. Our oldest reliable account of Scandinavian geography comes to us from the court of Alfred the Great, when a Norse nobleman called Ottar, visited and described his homeland and his travels across the northern coast to the White Sea. When describing Norway, he says that the country of the Norwegians was very long and very narrow. All of it that can be grazed or plowed lies by the sea, but even this is very rocky in some places. And wild mountains lie to the east, parallel with and above the cultivated land. On these mountains dwell Lapps. And the cultivated land is widest in the south, and always the further north you go, the narrower it becomes. In the south, it may be 60 miles wide or a little wider. In the middle, 30 or more, and in the north, where it is narrowest, he said that it might be 3 miles across the mountains. After this, the mountains are, in some places, as wide as can be traversed in a fortnight, and in others as wide as can be traversed in 6 days. On the other side of the mountains, parallel to the south part of the country, there is Sweden. Parallel to the north part, Quenaland. The Quenas sometimes make attacks on the Norwegians across the mountains, and at other times the Norwegians attack them. Throughout the mountains there are very large freshwater lakes, and from there they attack the Norwegians. They have very small and light boats. According to this account, the mountains are undesirable, not these well-utilized things. Even where the soil is rocky, people specifically avoid the mountains to live in the arable land by the sea. Iceland was the same way. In the Book of Settlements, or Landnámabók, the farms listed are all along the sea. The central mountains are uninhabitable, populated with trolls and outlaws. The Vikings also appear to have had a distaste for ice. Landnámabók tells us that the first person to overwinter in Iceland was Hrafnafloki Vilgerðarson, who landed in the Westfjords. The winter was very harsh with sea ice and heavy glaciers, and he hated it so much that he named it Iceland and left as soon as he was able. Similarly, Eric the Red named Greenland specifically because people will be more likely to come if it has a good name. If it was accurately described as icy, no Viking would want to live there. Fast forward to the 16th century, with a magnificent Carta Marina made by Olaus Magnus to educate his contemporaries in Venice about Scandinavia, and we see much the same thing. North Scandinavia is completely ice-free. Russia, Livonia, Lapland, Karolia, and Bjarmaland are surrounded by lakes frozen solid, where monsters, reindeer, and men mingle freely. But Sweden, Norway, and Denmark are ice-free. Norway is a little bit mountainous, but south of Trondheim, only one intrepid adventurer leads a horse across the mountains between Norway and Sweden. Now, to be fair, the Carta Marina does underrepresent the mountains of Norway. The pre-modern country is heavily focused on the sea as a connective route, precisely because the mountains made overland travel difficult over long distances. However, the physical representation on the map represents a cultural belief. Mountains and the harshness of the landscape only affect the Sami peoples, not the Norse ones. Perpetual interest in Iceland and Scandinavia in the following centuries was emphasized in the 1800s by, drumroll please, not Wagner! This time it's saga tourism, wealthy Europeans and Americans traveling to Iceland to see the sights of various sagas and enjoy the natural landscape. You know, like what we still do today. It is really very pretty. This included traveling up onto the glaciers and imagining Viking heroes on them. John Ross Brown in 1867 published The Land of Thor, which is a travelogue to Iceland complete with sketches. His opinion is that the towns were rather depressing, but the landscape is fantastic. I was at last in the land of the sagas, the land of fire and brimstone and boiling fountains. The land which, as a child, I had been accustomed to look upon as the Ultima Thule, where men and fish and fire and water were pitted against each other in everlasting strife. The British poet W.H. Auden, however, I think captures this movement best. He detailed his travels to Iceland in 1936 in a series of letters and a tourist guide, including his poem Journey to Iceland.
And the traveller hopes, let me be far from any physician, and the ports have names for the sea, the Citylis, the corroding, the sorrow, and north means to all reject. And the great plains are forever where the cold fish is hunted, and everywhere the light birds flicker and flaunt. Under the scolding flag the lover of islands may see at last, faintly, his limited hope. As he nears the glitter of glaciers, the sterile immature mountains intense in the abnormal day of this world, and a river's fan-like polyp of sand. Then let the good citizen here find natural marvels, a horseshoe ravine, an issue of steam from a cleft in the rock, and rocks and waterfalls brushing the rocks, and among the rocks birds. And the student of prose and conduct places to visit. The site of a church where a bishop was put in a bag, the bath of a great historian, the fort where an outlaw dreaded the dark. Remember the doomed man thrown by his horse and crying, beautiful as the hillside, I will not go. The old woman confessing, he that I loved the best, to him I was worst. For Europe is absent. This is an island, and therefore a refuge where the fast affections of its dead may be bought by those whose dreams accuse them of being spitefully alive, and the pale from too much passion of kissing feel pure in its deserts. Can they? For the world is, and the present, and the lie. The narrow bridge over the torrent and the small farm under the crag are the natural setting for the jealousies of a province. And the weak vow of fidelity is formed by the cairn, and within the indigenous figure on horseback on the bridle path down by the lake, the blood moves also by crooked and furtive inches, asks all our questions. Where's the homage? When shall justice be done? Oh, who is against me? Why am I always alone? No, our time has no favorite suburb, no local features of those of the young for whom all wish to care. The promise is only a promise, the fabulous country impartially far. Tears fall in all the rivers. Again the driver pulls on his gloves and in a blinding snowstorm starts upon his deadly journey. And again the writer runs howling to his art.
We can see the links already coming into focus. Iceland entangles the landscape and the saga, the Viking and the mountain. It is a fundamentally alien landscape, uncaring in face of all the politics and trials of interwar Europe, where the biggest threat is eking out an existence among the cold creatures and blinding, deadly snow. It is of course not what it promises to be, but as a place removed from ideology, ideology surrounds it. In the 20th century, we can link two new and disparate trends in creating the modern aesthetic. One is a direct derivation from saga tourism in historical fiction movies. Particularly influential is The Vikings, starring Kirk Douglas. The movie filmed in Norway and defines the classic image of the red and white sailed longship drifting in the fjords. There's a huge focus on landscape shots in the movie, even as it shows genuine Viking Age and saga activities. The landscape is a defining part of what that movie thinks it means to be a Viking, and so the two are linked. The other thread is coming out of popular literature in the 20th century, specifically pulp fiction. Robert Howard is perhaps the most influential writer here with the Conan stories. Conan is set in a fictional prehistoric Europe where every pseudo-historical civilization is real and present. Howard's Hyperborea, itself based on the description by Homer in the Odyssey, is ruled by invaders from the Arctic Circle, who very clearly represent the stereotype of Nordic peoples: tall, blonde hair, warlike nature. They are quite literally the descendants of apes who evolved after being displaced to the north. His Hyperborea is not itself unusually wintry, but its rulers absolutely are. This aesthetic is strengthened a lot by the work of two artists, Frank Frazetta and Boris Vallejo. Both of them, hugely influential within the pulp fantasy sphere for Conan and other works, share a similar aesthetic. Mostly naked Wagnerian warriors fight among jagged peaks against monsters and gods, seemingly impervious to the frostbite they are exposing themselves to. While Conan himself is technically Pictish, the Conan movie definitely pays its homage to both this art and Vikings, with plenty of landscape shots dominated by distant mountains. Importantly, while Pulp Fiction definitely has the snow plus mountain aesthetic going on, this is not really set in stone at this time. While Terry Jones' Eric the Viking has a few scenes with snow, the video game Rune, despite its Vikingness, totally misses it. When snow does appear alongside the Vikings in the late 90s and early 2000s, it is dominantly in a certain type of video games. Age of Empires and Age of Mythology do it, as does Bugs Bunny and Taz Time Busters. The common thread for these games is that they're showing a wide variety of geographies and cultures side by side. The graphical fidelity in that era of games isn't great, we'll say, and so the tools to distinguish different places are limited. To simplify, they go with the exaggerated, stylized aesthetic. The North is snowy, no questions asked. It clearly owes something to the style and popular memory established in the previous century, but it simplifies it down to a few environmental markers. Mountain, snow, sea, we're done. But now, we can finally turn to the current era of Norse media. Skyrim is perhaps our first thought for cementing this aesthetic. It is chock full of snowy mountains, and compared to the rest of Tamriel, it absolutely leans into the Vikings, crags, and snow. But it also represents a lot of flatlands in between them. Just look at the plains around Whiterun. It's not all snow all the time, and so actually ends up hewing kinda closer to the actual seasonal climate of Norway or Iceland than a true pastiche of it. The History Channel's Vikings is the next obvious candidate. It definitely leans into the mountains to the point of absurdity. Look again at Gamla Uppsala. It matches Adam of Bremen's 11th century description of the hall nestled in the mountains, but Adam of Bremen had no clue what he was talking about, and 5 seconds on the internet would reveal that there are no mountains anywhere near Uppsala. However, snow isn't all that common either. It seems to be turning up the dial on the 1958 Vikings movie rather than cementing the perpetual winter we've seen in the past few years. By 2018 though, it's clearly cemented. Take a look at God of War. Even as the Lake of the Nine is not super snowy, it's really hard to get away from snow for the vast majority of the game. Rune 2 has it, and of course, Assassin's Creed Valhalla's Norway exists. It's pretty well omnipresent, and it's only getting worse. Of course, individual games in the indie sphere were doing it earlier, but we're really looking at something between 2013 and 2018 to shove it into the mainstream. What's that noise? Oh no. While the television adaptation of Game of Thrones started in 2011, it took a few seasons to become a total cultural powerhouse, and so it still fits here. The wildlings in particular are our best reference. Westeros is a poorly disguised Britain, with the region north of the Wall being Scotland with the serial numbers filed off. However, in the show, it is coded extremely Scandinavian, even more so than the Iron Isles, which are also coded to the Vikings. Tormund Giantsbane is just the most fantasy Viking name imaginable, and Christopher Hivju is Norwegian. Game of Thrones did a lot to mainstream tropes present in Pulp Fiction, and its perpetually icy, barbarous wastes in the north are no exception. It's hard to overstate how important it is to understanding the modern imagination of the medieval world, and we'll be seeing its influence for a long time to come. For Honor, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Hellblade: Senua's Saga, God of War, and more all in some way owe a debt of aesthetics to Game of Thrones, and I'd be very surprised if this revitalized video game trope of snow Vikings goes away anytime soon. Now that we know where it comes from, we can actually start to take a look at why it's there. Amazingly, shockingly, everyone in the current era seems to be using snow to make pretty much the same cultural argument. The snow exists as a shorthand. These are harsh environments that produce harsh, if fundamentally noble, people. They revel in conflict and value strength above all else in order to survive in inhospitable landscape. Only in failure do they come ravaging the lands of softer, more fertile places and peoples. When they do, of course, it's a slaughter. The landscape has hardened them into incredible warriors. Seriously, they all do this. The Dredge of the Banner Saga, the Wildlings of Game of Thrones, the Vikings of Assassin's Creed Valhalla all do this to some extent. God of War looks like an exception, except that it's the landscape after it has already won. It's totally anathema to humans at this point. Assassin's Creed Valhalla says this idea most explicitly.
Now come and enjoy the splendor of my Shire.
You Saxons and your tiny splendor. You have never seen mountains, have you? Or deep fjords like a giant's axe wound? Or towering falls that steam in the dead of winter? Snow sparkling like a blanket of jewels. That is splendor.
Well, if your homeland is so splendorful, why come to England at all?
You cannot grow crops on a blanket of jewels.
Ha! Very true.
This is based on a genuine historical argument. The idea that the Viking Age was kickstarted due to population pressures limited by the low crop yields of the time has been made in scholarly contexts. And it's not entirely wrong, it did play some part. But it's not the primary or only aspect acknowledged today, and it certainly didn't shape the Vikings into exceptional warriors. They weren't. The Vikings weren't any better at warfare than any of their victims. They were just better at attacking places the military elite weren't. The argument as it is made in media is essentially one of environmental determinism. Culture is shaped entirely by environment, and people who adapt to survive a certain environment must be a certain way. Guns, germs, and steel is the premier popular historical example of this sort of argumentation, but games turn that dial up to 11. This is uncomfortable, to say the least. Apart from the physical discomfort I get from whatever frostbite extravaganza this is, environmental determinism has a bad habit of retroactively finding environmental reasons for history to play out the way it did. You know what else is correlated to environment? Skin tone. The native people of Skyrim are all extremely white. There are no people of color in Viking Age Scandinavia in For Honor or Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Conan and the Banner Saga make the people who survive the Frisia Wastes literally a different species of humanoids. This is a shorthand that is, at a core level, racially essentialist. This isn't entirely any of these games' fault. The framework they are inheriting is created with these features in mind. Auden, though not a fascist sympathizer himself, met Hermann Göring's brother while in Iceland in 1936, and Robert Howard was absolutely drawing on and emphasizing pseudoscientific theories of race in Conan. But these games do not have to buy into that image so uncritically. And yet, they do. They're tying landscape into morality, culture, and ethnicity in a way that is really deeply problematic. Now, to their credit, some of the media I've mentioned here do try and complicate this image. The wildlings aren't lacking culture despite being warlike. It's the White Walkers that are that. The Dredge are refugees, and we misinterpret them from fear of the unknown and half-remembered wars. The Vikings' martial culture is self-destructive in the end and fails in its dreams of conquest and glory. But all of these nuances come too late. Most people only play the very beginning of a game, and so making a nuanced argument at the end is really insufficient. It's setting up a house of cards in order to knock it down, when it would have been better to just not set it up in the first place. Because they set it up, it doesn't reject that environment determines culture. It just rejects whatever specific culture the environment appears to create. As much as I complain, I don't think Snow Vikings are going anywhere. Success feeds into success, and once something has proven resonant, it has a habit of burrowing deeper and deeper into popular imagination for a really long time. And you know what? That doesn't have to be a bad thing. Snow is really very pretty and makes for exceptional views. But these views are based in a centuries-long development of an exotic barbarian north that is hypermasculine and homogeneously white. So please, be thoughtful about how it's being used. Make Snow more than a set dressing, but something that is a narrative event with meaning. Be careful about proving your manliness by refusing to wear clothes in the winter. Like seriously, it's not needed. You just look dumb. Oh, and if it's winter, maybe don't have fresh peppers. They tend to freeze. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and join the Discord, check out these other videos, and consider supporting the channel here on YouTube and on Twitch. Coming up on April 9th is a lecture on Norse mythology that you won't want to miss.